All right. Welcome to Get Into Market. It has been a hot minute since we have recorded an episode, but I am super excited to have the guest we have this week, which is Chad Cosper, Principal Product Marketing Manager at Insight Software. Chad and I know each other from having worked together for a bit of what was it, like a little over a year. Chad, tell everyone about yourself and how you got to product marketing and what you're doing in your current role.
All right. Yeah, sure. It's great to be on podcast. I thought I'd never be asked. Uh, I've been doing product marketing for about almost 20 years. Um, Before that, I was in product management, and frankly, I'm doing product marketing because I wasn't a very good product manager. And In my time as a product marketer, I've worked mostly with enterprise, almost exclusively with enterprise companies on B2B software, doing things to improve their data from master data management to product information management. Right now at Insight, I work on our SAP portfolio. So helping, your large companies understand the information that's in their SAP ERP.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is funny is that like over my time in product marketing, I've known a number of people that have gone from product manager to product marketing, but hardly anybody goes the reverse direction.
That's a good point. I'd never thought about that. I think I know one. And then soon after he became a Gartner analyst. So I maybe that's the career trajectory there.
Yeah, probably not anymore. There's
No.
probably not a whole lot of people going from. But yeah, it is funny because it's like there's something about PM that they do not find fun, and the little bits and pieces of like PMM adjacent stuff that they were doing, I guess they seem to enjoy more,
That's
and
right.
that's where
Yeah,
they
we
stay.
get to do all the fun stuff, right?
We do get to do all the fun stuff, and the pay is like 90% of what a P. It might be 80, 90% of the way there. So it's like, what are you missing out on?
Right.
Well, Chad, I'm super glad to have you on. I think we talked about it a little bit. But the idea for this show, I think, is a little bit of a fun one, which is you are more than anybody I know. I'll just level with you there. A music fan to a degree that like I don't think anybody I know is, and I don't mean that as like a you're like fanatical about it. It's just like it's a huge part of your life. It's where like you spend a lot of your time.
And my money.
And your and your money. It's like Ticketmaster loves you.
Yes.
But there's and where you live, which is Austin, like there's a huge culture there for it. You get to see folks that a lot of other people won't get to see until they're much bigger names, and that's probably a really cool aspect and probably why you stuck around there. But a part of the music you're a huge fan of has its own like mini subculture, not mini, like its own culture
Yeah.
and world around it. And in the most like unhippie way, it is in and of itself a product, and that is the Grateful Dead, whatever you want to call their current iteration, the Dead, I guess. But it's its own phenomenon, and also has evolved so much, just like any product would over that same period of time.
Yep.
And so I just kind of want like I am not an expert on the Dead. Um, you'll learn some new things about me that probably I didn't want to share when we worked together, but like my knowledge of the Dead is pretty limited. But tell me a little bit like because also and not to like age you, but you're a little younger than like some of the folks that would have grown up with the Dead and are the longest time fans. So how did you get into them?
Yeah. I'm of the age that likely heard of them first in '87 with Touch of Grey. And that video came out. And so I'm kind of right at the end of the era of people who got to see Jerry. Um, so I got on the bus, so to speak, uh, when I was given a cassette and told, I think you're going to dig this. And I did. And, I think that that was distinctly different than a lot of the other people my age who did get turned on to them with Touch of Grey and that video, and Touch of Grey was their only top 40 hit. I got into them, I think, the way a lot of the older crowd did, and since then I've seen a lot of Dead music. I've seen the Dead, the other ones, Further, Rat Dog, Wolf Brothers. I've seen Dead and Company 26 times. Um, yeah. Um, but I never saw Jerry, and that's something that might differentiate me from other Deadheads my age. I did have the chance. I spent my freshman year of college in Vermont, where many of my classmates regularly drove to Dead or Jerry Garcia band shows. The summer of '95, my girlfriend and a mutual friend were going to the St. Louis shows on what turned out to be their final tour. They tried to get me to go, and I didn't. Then, obviously, a few months later, as we were looking to book tickets for the New Year's Eve run in Oakland, that's when Jerry died. It was one of those early lessons for me that stays with me. See your idols when you can, because you never know how long you're going to have them. And I think that regret, that specific irreversible kind, is actually part of why the Dead stays with so many people. The music carries that weight for a lot of people. Not just fans who were there, but the ones who were almost there, or even the ones who wish they were there.
Yeah. Like also when you were saying that, so Vermont 95, like was that I'm going to expose all levels of my ignorance here. Was that like fish country back then? Like were they kind of
So,
like as popular or like what
I'm
was
gonna
the
date
yeah.
myself. I was in Vermont in '91, so it was fish country for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Um and I think there's obviously even musically like as kind of niche in some ways as Grateful Dead was, like its impact branches out quite a bit into modern music today even. Like I think I get exposing my ignorance here, but like festivals like Bonnaroo, I don't know if those would exist without um the Dead and some of the influences that they had kind of in the early iterations of that music festival. And I think it's changed a little bit over time from what I've seen of the lineups that have gone there. But like the people would be at their own peril, I think, like underestimating the Dead's broader influence in music, like even pop music generally.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that things like Bonnaroo wouldn't have existed. I think we'll probably get into it a little bit later. The Dead's influence and impact, to your point, across so many genres of music. I remember the night that Jerry Garcia died. I wasn't there. I actually had tickets to go to Lollapalooza that night in Austin, and I ended up not going because Jerry had died, and I sat up with my girlfriend and our mutual friend who had gone to see the shows in St. Louis and listened to Jerry's songs all night. But my point was, Sonic Youth of all people played a song that night dedicated to him, and they credit the Grateful Dead as being huge influences. And that's kind of my background before the Dead. I was a punk rocker. I was into Sonic Youth and the Replacements, and I still am.
Yeah.
But the Dead definitely have a place.
Yeah. And like even if I so and part of the thing that to me is interesting about the Grateful Dead is that I do associate with one hippie counterculture stuff.
Yeah.
And at the same time, if you think about that sort of influence on other parts of music, um, what is it like parrot heads for Buffett? What is it? What is it
Hmm.
that they're called? But like
I think so.
referencing the
Yeah.
same thing and the idea that
Yeah.
like, and to me, there's also a very specific but very different culture associated with like Jimmy Buffett fans. Um, and so even there, that influence across genres, even if it's just how we talk about the fan base and what it means to be like a parrot head or whatever it was. So tell me a little bit about because I just don't know that much. Like, where are the roots of the Grateful Dead in the broader like musical sense for what else was going around? Because it's in the mid '60s, right? Um, and when I think of the mid '60s, like my parents grew up in Michigan. I'm like growing up was just constantly listening to oldies and Motown. Um,
Not a lot of Grateful Dead on those
not a lot of Grateful
channels.
Dead on those stations. Um, but the very different music than what was happening in Motown at the same time, and like jazz is deep into bebop at that point, or like almost post pop, and so musically, there's just a whole bunch of stuff happening in the '60s. Like Beatles are happening, like they're in
True.
1965, they're mean swing. So tell me a little bit about like where the Dead sat and all that.
So it was 1965. And I think it's important to remember as part of their story that it was 1965 and it was San Francisco. It was about the counterculture. While the band, I don't know that anybody would ever call them hippies. Certainly, their fans were, and they came out of that counterculture movement, the Haight Ashbury scene. They were the live entertainment at Ken Kesey's acid test. So that whole psychedelic movement, that whole psychedelic moment that was going on in San Francisco at the time, um, was definitely part of their origin story. But what's important for this conversation is something that you kind of alluded to, and that's that they're not really defined by that moment. They outlasted it by 30 years. And the crucial thing, the thing that makes everything else make sense is that they were not a studio band that toured.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, in what we think of being a rock and roll band, right?
Mm-hmm.
They didn't go into the studio, record an album, go out on tour to support that album and try to sell copies of that album. That's just not what they did. They were a live band that also made records. So for them, the show was always the thing. The record was almost secondary. They made some genuinely beautiful records like Working Man's Dead and American Beauty, but they also made some genuinely strange records like Anthem of the Sun. To them, the records were almost R&D, if you will.
Yeah.
They were working ideas out in the studio, and then they went on the road and evolved those songs for decades, really, 30 years of near continuous touring. It's not exactly, it's more than just a career. I think it was a way of life for them, and even after the Dead, I think you could say for Bob Weir, it was 60 years of consistent touring.
Yeah, and I mean, like the other thing that just keeps popping up to me is like in that same time period, like the Beatles, obviously huge. The inverse of that, right? Like their only thing was putting out albums, and there was a huge stretches of period where they weren't going out on tour at all. So here's a part that uh, I'll expose a little bit about myself, and you can judge me. My familiarity with like the Dead and jam bands in general, and this is partly an age thing, is mostly like Dave Matthews Band,
Mm,
who I do like, but benefited a lot from the Grateful Dead's taping culture. Um,
they did.
they did. And if I were to kind of carry this conversation back to like this band as a product, like this is the free trial, right? This is their um, this is
Yeah.
how they grew, and it wasn't through selling record albums or vinyl. It was they grew organically by word of mouth, but by sharing their music for free or having other people share it for them by like referrals, basically for free.
Right. And, not only did they let their fans record their shows, they went so far as to designate a specific section in every venue for tapers to set up their equipment. They went out of their way to make sure that the tapers had good sight lines, that they had good acoustics. They actively made the recording experience better for the people who were doing it, who were carrying that on, and they got nothing financially from that. They got no licensing fee, no revenue share. And what it became was their distribution network before distribution networks even existed. When somebody got a tape, fell in love, showed up to a show, brought three friends, the fans built the entire infrastructure themselves. Tape libraries passed hand to hand. That's what happened to me. I had something like 120 tapes when I was in college, and it was all
Whoa.
passed hand to hand
Yeah.
for me. And this was all peer to peer file sharing 30 years before Napster, right?
Yeah, where they weren't upset about it though, or suing people.
And
Yeah.
I don't think, and this is going to be something that comes up a lot, I think, in our conversation is that, I don't picture Jerry Garcia and Bob Weir sitting in a room making this conscious decision. They as much as they were pioneers of a lot of things, I don't think that this particular decision, for instance, was one that they made based on finances. For them, they didn't feel like they owned the music. They
Mm.
didn't feel like they owned the experience. Once they played it and it was out there, that became a document, not the product, right?
Yeah.
And so they didn't mind if that document was traded around because it helped boost the product, and the product was those live shows and people coming to those live shows, providing the type of energy that the band really fed off of.
Yeah. And uh, one of the interesting things to me about taping, especially for that era, and this is me showing my age on the other end of it a little bit, which is like, for there will be folks that maybe don't know what, what we're talking about, but like there's no fast way to transfer audio from one tape to another. Like
No.
it's an entirely slow manual process. And so the idea that like this is the fast way to like get the word around about this band, and like for you to collect, like I assume at that point it was cassette tapes, but like um even just sharing the music with each other would have been like an incredibly burdensome, pain in the ass process for anybody to participate in. Um,
Yeah, but we didn't think about it that way. We were
yeah,
we were getting new music. We were getting it, and here's the thing. It was probably, I would get 10 tapes in a hall or whatever,
yeah,
and there wouldn't be a single song on there that I didn't know,
right,
but I hadn't heard those versions yet. So I was excited. And, to your point, it wasn't just about how long it took to record them, but I was getting some. I was trading with people from all over the world, right?
yeah,
So,
yeah.
so I would find somebody, and it might take a month to get the tape I'm looking for.
With a fragile medium, like
Right?
I mean,
Yeah.
because by the time that I had any sort of like exposure to what like the taping trading scene would be for a band, like you're either there's a way to download the files, or you're sending someone discs and they'll burn the discs for you, but all that's a digital process that can take like a few minutes. um we're talking like what, 3 hour shows, three
Yeah.
hours of audio that's getting transferred from tape to tape, and degrading probably to some
Oh,
degree each time. Like it's,
absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely degrading. In fact, I mean, in the taper culture, there were is if it's a soundboard, that made it more highly valuable. If it was recorded by by Betty. It was called a Betty board. Um, and those are really highly sought after. But the more you recorded them, the more um, the more the music degraded for sure.
Yeah. Um, and so, and we haven't talked about it. So for folks that aren't familiar with the band at all, Grateful Dead, famous for improvising, like they're like I don't know how much of where the improvisation came from in terms of like jazz being a root and all the stuff that like Coltrane and Miles Davis and stuff were doing like a little bit before that, but certainly like improvisation in the 50s and 60s and music generally was probably picking up speed a little bit. But the idea that like every show you're going to play a song, that song, a new way, you're not going to play the same songs every night. There's a unique experience, like same band, different night is going to be a whole different experience. How unique was that for them at that time, and how much did that play into sort of how they grew their audience?
I I would say it was extraordinarily unique. Um, you know, there's a quote, and I had it to come back to later, but I think it's good to bring up now. Jerry Garcia once said, "It's not enough to be the best of the best. You have to be the only one doing what you're doing," um, which I think is a great quote for product marketing and product in general. But the nobody else was doing what they were doing. Even nowadays, not many fish might be. Dave Matthews didn't. He had hits that he had to play every night. The Dead had hits, but they didn't care about that. And I think you're right to point to people like Miles Davis and John Coltrane, both of whom appeared with the Dead. By the way, they both played on stage with them.
I didn't know that. That's
Um,
cool.
they were big influences. And so the set list was improvised every night, and not just the jams, the actual song selection, the order, the length of everything. There became a bit of a model, and I think most deadheads could tell you, oh, that's a first set song, that's a second set song. So there was a bit of a model, but it was really improvised. And so people tracked set list obsessively. There are people who had seen 300 shows, but they were still looking for, that perfect dark star, probably from Fillmore East in 1970, or Scarlet Fire from Cornell in 77. Every version was different. Some, frankly, were ordinary. Um, There were even some that weren't very good. Um, but some versions of the songs were absolutely transcendent, and
Yeah.
you showed up not knowing which one you were going to get. And I think that variation, to your point, was not a quirk; it was the entire product design. They
Yeah. So
they
you think that was more conscious? So like taping uncut, like there people come, they're taping the shows, they just let it happen. It wasn't an intentional thing. But you think the desire for each show to be its own unique experience, maybe good or bad, but
yeah.
like the uniqueness is the design.
Yes.
Yeah. Um,
Absolutely. I,
yeah.
I I do think that, if you think look back at their early days of playing, as I mentioned, as the house band in Ken Kesey's Acid Test, that was all completely improv. And yes, I do think that this became uh by design. There's a line in one of their songs, and it became the title of Phil Lesh's biography. Phil Lesh, the bass player, the original bass player, called it's "Searching for the Sound," and that's what they were doing every night. They were searching for the sound.
Yeah. Um, okay, if I think about like a modern musician trying to do what they're doing now, like is that even possible? Like could you grow organically without a record deal? Like I guess you see some of that on social media and how people get big, but
Yeah,
it
I'd
feels
say
different.
I would I think I would have said, no, absolutely not a year ago. Uh, but I do think that it can be done. I think it's rare. You look at a band like Billy Strings. I think
Mm-hmm.
Billy Strings is really tapping into a lot of the culture and the ethos of what made the Grateful Dead special. Um, while at the same time not having a whole lot of radio play. I think, maybe one or two songs here and there.
Yeah.
But I think it would be very difficult to do the same thing. I mean, we're living in an age. One of the big things about the Dead was that culture, that the Deadheads,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that Deadheads. To describe them, people have asked me, "Can I call you a deadhead? Is that a pejorative?" And like, no, no, that's what we call ourselves. So
Yeah.
it's all good, and it's not one of those things. If you're not one of us, you can't call us that. Um, but
Let's list all of those things,
yeah,
all of
right.
those examples. We'll list them out loud.
I
Get
thought about
canceled.
giving an example and then decided better. Um, if you define Deadhead, it's not fans. That word is too small. It's a culture. Every show had a scene. The parking lot outside the venue, vendors, traders, people who had followed the tour for months. There was an entire informal economy: food, art, bootleg T-shirts, tapes. There were people living out of their vans, going city to city, show to show. It was a traveling community that happened to organize itself around a band. And the Dead didn't build that. They didn't design it. They didn't manage it. They didn't even monetize it. They just created the conditions, the music, the openness, the lack of control, and then got out of the way. And so I think it's possible for a band nowadays to carry that on, but it's going to be very, very difficult in this culture, I think, to do that.
Three things that have like kind of surfaced as things that I want to talk a little bit about. One is if I think about like what going back to like products and how they build communities, like it seems like there are as cliche as it is, like lessons to be learned from that, getting out of the way and letting a community grow on its own, and become those advocates for you without like forcing it. Um, but two, if I'm thinking about like how, so you talked a little bit about like there would be sought after recordings because of one particular song or a couple different renditions of how they did it. How does that information in the 1970s, pre-internet, you know what I mean? Like that is also just a crazy thing to think through in today's age of like how fast news travels and like the ability to, I mean, there's websites now with like set lists, and I'm sure there are websites with Grateful Dead set lists going all the way back to when they started. And so like all that information
Yeah,
now is like right at your fingertips.
yeah.
But back then that information had to travel in different ways. And like how fast could you get that? And I guess part of it is that those mobile communities, but how else was it?
Well, so it that's really what it was. It
Yeah.
was word of mouth,
Yeah.
and it was the trading culture. I mean, the Dead had a what they called the Grateful Dead Almanac that came out. I want to say it was quarterly, but it certainly didn't have like the set list and things like that in it. And so whenever you would um, hear about something, a particularly good version of a song that you liked, you went out of your way to find it. And one thing that we have to think about, at this point, pre 1987, the scene was much smaller than what maybe many people are thinking about with the Grateful Dead. The majority of their career, they played in theaters, not in arenas. It was
Mm.
it was not until the late '80s that they started to play in arenas. and so the scene was smaller. It was more close knit, and um, that dynamic between that pre-'87 scene and the post-'87 scene was one that did actually spur some changes to their business model, but also threatened the product itself, that live show.
Mm-hmm. Um, you said something else that stuck out to me earlier also that was about like the band themselves versus like the folks that followed them, which is that like they had like Deadheads. There were definitely like hippies and the Deadheads and that sort of thing. And I don't even like, it feels weird to say hippies nowadays. Um, it feels like a pejorative. And I guess in some ways it is, but
Maybe that's why people are worried about saying Deadhead. I don't
yeah,
know.
I think so. But I remember reading a quote about Mick Jagger that was basically like, you know, the Mick Jagger you see on stage is very different from the one that's reading like the Financial Times on his private jet the next morning. Um, and you saying that like Jerry and the band weren't hippies either, like counterculture, sure, but counterculture and hippies also different. What was the difference between the band and the fans?
You know, how should I put this? They were not hippies. There wasn't a big difference between the band and the early fans, especially. They were friends and family, and many of them ended up getting hired. And at one point, the Dead had something like 70, 75 full-time employees with health insurance and all sorts of things. Um, but as the scene grew, um, there were, how should I put it? There was tension between fans who didn't know the etiquette. They didn't know that you don't request songs at a Dead show, that there is a second set and it's distinct from the first set, and different little things like that were important to the band. I think that I'm having a hard time answering this because it's very difficult, I think, to separate the band from what they would consider to be their real fans, right? Their core hardcore fans. And these are the fans that they did everything for, right? So the taping rules, they did that for the fans.
Your
Uh,
power users, if you
your
would.
your power users for
Yeah.
sure. The mailing list that they used for getting tickets, they did specifically because their friends in the scene weren't able to get tickets anymore. It was scalpers who were buying up all the tickets. So yes, they concentrated on their power users at the expense of well, not really at the expense of, because I think that the casual fan, when they went to a show and experienced the product, because again, I think for the Grateful Dead, the product was the show. It wasn't even a recording of the show. It wasn't the tapes. It wasn't the physical document of that moment. Even the casual fans who experienced that product um, had a good time. They were entertained because the experience was high quality. But even though the experience wasn't for them, the
Yeah.
experience was for the band. The
Yeah.
experience was for the power user.
Yeah. Okay. So two questions I have around that. One is, has that changed? If I think about a band that takes up a residency at the Sphere, that feels like it may have changed a little bit. But obviously, Jerry's not here anymore, so there's a little bit of that. But the other part was, how did that affect their revenue? I don't know how much of that's like public information about like what the band was making over time, but like, Was that kind of in service of their kind of primary revenue stream and how they were able to stay afloat?
Absolutely. Touring was their entire revenue stream for most of the time that the band was active. I think that even now, though, it's more about licensing and merch. They still, even though there's only one member still alive. Um, and when I say that, there's only one original member who's still alive, because Mickey Hart came on a little bit later. The that revenue stream coming from touring, if you look at most of the '80s and through '95, they're going to show up in the top five, top three of the highest grossing bands of that year, and that's competing against Michael Jackson selling Thriller-sized records, right?
Right. Yeah.
They're still in that conversation. Whether that can be done today, that's harder to say. I don't think that it probably could be. Although I don't know where all of this ticket money is going. It must be going to Ticketmaster because first time I went to see the Dead, probably paid like $30, and the last time it was closer to 300.
Wow.
And
Was it really 300? Where were you seated?
we had really good seats. It was at the Sphere, and we had really good seats. Um, and it probably was an aftermarket situation, but um, I don't know how much of that the company, the band gets nowadays, and what are the streaming rights and all the entire music industry has changed. And I don't think that the Dead would, if they were still around, if they were still going as the Grateful Dead, if Jerry was still around and so forth, I don't think that they were the type of guys who would have been looking around and saying, "Man, look what Taylor Swift is doing, going around the world and selling out these giant shows uh, and doing movies in the local theater." They'd probably look at that and say, "Well, good for her, but that's not me. That's not something I'm going to replicate." So they weren't out doing competitive intelligence, or if they
Yeah.
were, it wasn't changing their product. They were still focused, laser focused on their power users.
Yeah. Do you think this is an inelegant way to put it, but were they artists that had a business, or was it a business that had artists? And I guess by that I mean like the shift that's happened over time where it became the Dead and they have a residency at the Sphere. That feels to me like substantively different than what they started out as, right?
Yeah.
No shade to that. But like I guess like has that shifted over time? And
And,
yeah.
a lot of people said, "Hey, Jerry would just be turning over in his grave right now with this sphere thing." To answer your question, they were most definitely musicians who had to deal with the business.
Hmm.
And they made a lot of mistakes. They lost almost all of their money in the mid '70s because they entrusted it to one of the members' fathers to take care of it, and he took off. There's a famous song about it, and that the "steal your face" logo. That's steal your face right off your head. That's what they're talking about.
Yeah.
They made mistakes, and but along the way they came up with these ideas, either probably accidentally, this freemium economy. They were doing freemium content 30 years before Silicon Valley paid $30 million to study it and pioneer it,
Yeah.
if you will.
Um, what and this is where I guess we have to be really careful about this analogy of the music and band as a product, but I mean it's not a completely unfair, like it is an economic product in every shape and form, like it made a ton of money. But what changed about the product post Jerry Garcia's death? Like how does that fundamentally change
Yeah.
um what it what it eventually was and then became?
You know, that was that is an interesting thing, and I think it's a conversation that's still being had, right? Because Bob now, he just passed away just a few months ago in January of this year. And really Bob and Jerry were the heart of the Grateful Dead. There were obviously Phil was important and others, but when Jerry died, uh the band came together and said, look, there's two things that are important to us. One is we're never going to perform under the name Grateful Dead again because that's Jerry. They did actually perform under the name Grateful Dead, but only as a tribute. The Fare Thee Well shows that they did in San Francisco and in Chicago. Um, but the other thing was, no matter what, we want this thing to keep going, right? So it started with the Dead, which was everybody besides Jerry, and the tour I saw had Joan Osborne singing some of his songs, and then there were others. There was Further, there was Phil and Friends, Rat Dog, the Wolf Brothers, and then of course 2015, you've got Dead and Company, which I think changed the scene, changed the conversation dramatically,
Yeah.
and I think it's important to point out that while Dead and Company is part of the Grateful Dead family, it is a distinct band to itself. It's not a tribute act. It's a distinct band with its own motion, its own product, and really, it's the one that ended up at the Sphere.
Yeah. And you, to be clear, like that is the one you bought tickets. Like you do like that product.
I do.
Yeah.
So, you know, I'll tell you, when Dead and Company was announced, I was skeptical.
Hmm.
Genuinely, John Mayer felt like a celebrity booking.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
somebody had looked at the calendar, seen a gap in the touring schedule, and called the most famous guitar player they could get.
I mean, he is the Miles Davis of our time, though, so it does make sense for him to be.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. And
That was
and
a
I
joke.
didn't
Do people
I
really think
didn't
of him that way?
well, uh, you know, I didn't go to a show on that first tour. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but since then, I've seen them at least once a year, with the exception of 2020 when COVID canceled the tour.
Yeah.
And that's because I was wrong. I was wrong about John. And it only took that one show to understand that John Mayer is a true fan. He's a
Mm-hmm.
phenomenal guitar player.
Sure.
Now, I'm being charitable when I call him a decent singer, but he did his vocal register was such that he was able to bring back some of the blues standards that Jerry's voice, for instance, didn't play. Some of the songs that Pigpen played back in the beginning of the Dead, and when Pigpen died, you know, kind of went out of the canon. But the the guitar playing and the singing are almost beside the point. I when I saw over 26 shows of theirs, including 9 at the Sphere, was something harder to
So many.
manufacture. Yeah, well,
I didn't know you'd seen that many at the Sphere in and of itself.
I saw 9 there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, what I saw there was something harder to manufacture than technical ability. It
Yeah.
was he never tried to make the show about himself. Um, he was there to serve the music. in a band whose entire identity was built around subordinating the individual to the experience.
Hmm.
That's the only thing that really matters, and he passed that test every night. I think about it was almost too late in my run of realizing this at the Sphere, because previous to the Sphere, I was seeing them in arenas and University of Colorado football stadium and Wrigley Field and
Yeah.
things like that. So I wasn't able to get very close. At the Sphere, I was able to get really close. And being able to see John and Jeff Clemente, the keyboardist for Dead and Company, trade solos, just messing with each other, playing off the energy. I thought, that's it. That's what this has always been about. And Jerry did that with Brent Midland, the keyboardist of the late '80s. The music was the conversation, and nobody was trying to win the conversation. Uh, the band modeled that same openness they asked of the audience, and what I saw in those 26 times I saw Dead and Company was that culture
Mm.
that culture transmitting.
Hmm.
It's like I said earlier, it's not a tribute act. They were a real band, and that's the difference. There are complaints about the band, and I think that they're legitimate. Dead and Slow was one thing that people called them, or
I
S-
can't. Well,
Slow and Company was another one.
can I just like uh, drumming at the age of 80
Mm,
feels like it would just be difficult, and so I just don't know what anyone's expectations can be for someone to play the drums at. I mean, how old is he? Uh,
we talking about Bill here.
yeah,
Um,
well, yeah, because it was back. Like how there have
so
been varying stages, I guess, of this, but they have had some like older drummers playing at
that's
various
right.
stages. Yeah,
Bill Kreutzmann, he was the original drummer of the Grateful Dead. He was the drummer of Dead and Company until 2023. He did not play any of the shows in Vegas, and that was all health reasons. But his counterpart, Mickey Hart, who is a little bit younger than that, but he's still in his 70s.
yeah,
He's up there playing, gongs and
yeah,
multiple gongs
yeah.
and drums and this thing that he calls the beam, um, which basically just creates vibrations and noise.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's just what do you expect?
And when you're talking about the Sphere, so look, have you been to the Sphere yet?
Only seen the outside of it.
You've only seen the outside of it. So, experientially, it's probably the most on brand thing the Dead ever did.
I mean,
If you
they were known, right, for like I for a crazy sound system too, right?
Right, the
They
wall
were
of
always
sound.
innovating,
Yeah,
like how they did their sound design and like
yep,
all of that, and like it was all tied to the experience I think they were trying to create.
that's right.
So I guess that, and that is my little piece of knowledge there. But I guess thematically though, that does tie into like what would be appealing to even them with Jerry Garcia in modern day, um,
Absolutely. The
and
the
experience.
wall
Yeah,
of sound was a big part of their past in the '70s. They carried it with them from show to show, and like you said, it was for the benefit of the audience. It was for that experience. And so when you look at the Sphere, it's immersive, it's a premium, it's the wall of sound. Um, and a show at the Sphere is entirely about the show. So here you had a band that always prioritized the live experience, that is their product, playing inside a technology purpose built to make the live experience more intense than anything that came before it. But on the other hand, it also came with $200 tickets in Las Vegas, not my favorite city. In fact, the dates they chose in 2024 were surface of the sun hot, so hot that they had to move Shakedown Street to a hotel ballroom. And they were playing to a room full of people who could afford to pay the premium prices
Hmm.
to get in there. And honestly, that's exactly what dead pre 1987 Deadheads were afraid of when Touch of Grey went to number one.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess the elephant in the room here is we talked a lot about product, but not as much about brand. Is like there's a lot of brand elasticity that has carried through, um, that has folks that were listening to them live, going to shows back in the 70s, and still being able to go to the Sphere and not hate the experience.
That's right.
Yeah.
But you also saw a lot of kids.
Yeah.
The shows, the Dead and Company shows in general skewed to a younger audience. Now, many of them were there with their parents,
Wow.
which was cool, right?
Yeah.
That was really common, was to see somebody in their 20s with their parents who were in their 50s, or who had seen the Dead, and so that was a cool kind of changing of the guards for them.
Yeah. Um,
Passing of the torch, I should say. That's not changing of the guard.
last quick question. Your wife, is she a fan? Was she a fan of the Grateful Dead before y'all met, or
No,
was that a learned? Does she like
no.
them now?
Does she like them now? She appreciates them now. She she did she went to one show at the Sphere, and enjoyed it. That's the only Dead and Company show she's been to. Um,
Wow.
we there is this whole thing, every night, every Sphere show ended the same way. It ended with, well, it started with the camera like zooming out from San Francisco up into space, and
Oh
then
yeah, yeah.
and
I
then
think I've seen a video of that. Yeah.
and then it took you on the video show, the sound show, or the video show would take you on a different experience throughout the entire trip. And then later it would come back
Hmm.
down to Haight Ashbury, um, and um, and then it would flash up these words that say "dead forever."
Hmm.
And at the time, it felt very celebratory and very intentional. But with Bob's passing, thinking about the things that his family had said, that he wants the canon to be still sung 300 years from now. He wants he the Dead, for him and for many in the community, for many in the band and the family of the band, they wanted to continue going on. And I bring that up because it is continuing to go on. There is O'Teal, who's the bass player for Dead and Company. He's out touring. Jeff Comenti's out touring. Phil Lush's son is out touring. My wife and I, we're big fans of this bluegrass duo named Gillian Welch and David Rawlings,
Hmm.
and they're right now, that right tonight, they're playing in the Capitol Theater in Port Chester, New York. Probably not when this airs, but when we're recording, for sure.
Yeah.
Um, they are out on this little mini tour celebrating an album called Reckoning,
Yeah.
which was one of the Dead's acoustic records. And Amanda and I will be at the show in New Orleans in a week and a half. And to me, that's Dead forever, right? And I think it's something that if nothing else, my wife is at least accepted to buy in on.
I'll bring this to something that I do have more familiarity with, just from a personal level, real quick, to tie this out. But it's two things. One, I've been a long time UNC basketball fan. We just hired a coach that's not from the UNC coaching tree sort of thing. So it's just kind of feels very different. And then the other thing is, and I don't even know who it's going to be, but the Bond movie series,
Oh,
whoever's going to
right.
be the next James Bond is probably going to be like younger than me. And so there is this thing of like, as I get older, the distance between things that I used to really enjoy, and I'm not going to defend all the crazy shit that's in a James Bond movie, but they are like good movie spectacles.
Sure.
Um, has like
And
it
I'm voting.
feels
I'm rooting for Idris Elba, by the way.
I mean, sure, like anybody could be. He would be good because he's older than me. Like I
Yeah.
feel like I'd like
Right.
that. But there's something that kind of like shifts as these cultural things that have hung on for a very long time have evolved, and my distance from them grows as I get older. Like, what happens for you? I think we've hinted at this a little bit in just your last answer about your wife's interaction with it. But when the last kind of folks that were part of the original Grateful Dead, or even the folks that were part of that more original experience when Jerry Garcia was alive, as those folks die, does that shift what the Dead was and were more to like a nostalgic thing that you want to hang on to, or is it still to you this living thing that you continue to kind of cherish and have part of your life?
So to me personally, it's definitely still a living thing.
Yeah,
You know, I listen to the Grateful Dead, not exclusively by any stretch of the imagination, but quite often, quite a bit. They have influenced many of my favorite musicians. My favorite musicians often will cover them. As I mentioned, Gillian Welch, I've been going to her shows for 30 years. I've been a fan of the Grateful Dead for 35.
yeah,
So to me, um, it's never going to be a nostalgic thing as long as new generations continue to find the music and resonate with it in a way that the previous generations did. Now, is it the exact same thing? No, because that product is over, right?
yeah,
The the product is no longer for sale, if you will. It's only the artifacts, or it's only um, people carrying on that tradition. But to answer your question, I think my hope is that that Bob's right. That 300 years from now, people are still playing the music of the Grateful Dead.
yeah, yeah. Great note to end on. We always close out the podcast with a section that we call lessons learned, which is just any random thing, work or personal life related, that you've picked up recently. I'll go first just to not put you on the spot. Mine was just thinking about, and I know it's something we've talked about on the podcast before, but kids, Chad, I don't know how often you hear this in your everyday life at work, but 6'7" stuff. I'm sure Steve's always saying 6'7" to you. Uh, but 6'7". So everybody's always like rolling their eyes and groaning whenever the kids are saying 6'7". But when I was growing up, Jim Carrey was at like his peak, like Ace
Yeah.
Ventura, The
Okay.
Mask, all these movies, Dumb and Dumber. The amount of times that like an elementary school teacher then would have heard some kid do a Jim Carrey impression and say "alrighty then" was like 80 times a day. And there's just no way that that was not fundamentally worse to hear all the time than hearing a kid say 6'7" nowadays. Like,
I'm of the age where it was "Where's the beef?"
yeah, like always, kids will always find something to be annoying with. I would just argue it was more annoying back. Like, hearing
Yeah,
kids do Ace Ventura impressions
that's
a
true.
million times worse than a kid saying 6'7" when they see those numbers pop up. Uh, just terrible. All right, Chad, what was your lesson learned?
Um, you know, I'm going to come back to the topic and the band. I have been thinking a lot about it, and I appreciate the opportunity to come on to the podcast and to think about one of my favorite topics in this particular way, which most people don't want to talk to me about. Um, and say, for me, the lesson learned is maybe a counterintuitive one. And that's that intentional strategy might be overrated. Um, Almost none of what we talked about today with the dead was planned. The taper section came from a values belief. The direct ticketing came from loyalty to specific people. The mailing list came from wanting to talk to fans directly. The business outcomes like the distribution network, the CRM, these were all side effects because the band was just doing what they wanted to do and what made their fans happy.
Yeah, like two things that we can tie back to the very super serious world of B2B software marketing, which would be like they were laser focused, I guess, on like what they wanted an experience for the folks showing up to their shows to be. Like that was not haphazard. That was very like designed and something that they've put a lot of thought into. Um, and then the other to that would just be like they did have a very clear point of view musically that also like was very much a part of that product or whatever. But like if they had not been, if what they had chased was an existing sound that was happening at the time or a specific genre that they wanted to kind of replicate or riff on, like that also would not have benefited them to the extent that they ultimately landed, which is also another thing, is like they had a point of view and that they really wanted to focus on what that experience was like for folks.
Absolutely. If they had looked around and uh, done what their competitors were doing, they might have released, 10 or 12 albums. 3 or 4 of them were good,
Yeah.
and we wouldn't be talking about them right now.
Yeah. Chad, this has been super fun. I know you and I don't get to talk enough, but it
No,
is
we
always
don't.
fun talking to you.
Yeah.
I do enjoy the conversations that we have. You can find this podcast on most Tuesdays, some Tuesdays, not all Tuesdays right now. Life's a little crazy. But Chad, it was super great to have you on. Thank you for joining and hope everyone has a good time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.